Harry and Meghan's royal wedding was an embarrassment, a total farce in fact. From the bride and her family to the ceremony itself, this wedding was not fit for royalty, and it did away with over 1,000 years of history as the royals embraced what was described as a very modern ceremony. And didn't the media love it? The mainstream media used the royal wedding as a tool with which to attack European traditions and culture, and of course, the media used the spectacle as a huge rubber stamp of approval for multiculturalism and interracial relationships. But whilst the newscasters enthusiastically rubbed their hands as they gushed over the way that this wedding reflected modern British values, and as the press ran story after story about how Meghan and Harry were a fairy tale couple that the British public had fallen in love with, the actual truth of the matter was very different. Meghan was hardly fit to marry a prince. She is, of course, a Hallmark Channel actress, a divorcee, and is 4 years Harry's senior. What's more, she has starred in sex scenes, and numerous topless photos of her are floating around the internet. In fact, just days before the wedding, the Daily Star ran the cringeworthy headline, and I quote, "Meghan, my 3 in bed was fun. Harry's girl just loved her telly-sex scene. Meghan Markle has been hiding a saucy little secret from Prince Harry. She once filmed a 3 in a bed, and both suits show hunks could be at the royal wedding." End quote. Hardly what you would expect of someone marrying into the royal family, and a huge departure from the classy demeanour of Kate Middleton, who married Harry's brother William just 7 years earlier. But this wasn't the first embarrassing TV scene Meghan had been in. I read this from the Daily Mail, and I quote, "This one's a bit dirty, Harry." Prince's girlfriend Meghan Markle is seen performing sex act in a car during a premiere episode of 90210 in newly resurfaced scene. Since embarking on a romance with Prince Harry, many of Meghan Markle's former roles have come back to haunt her, a number of which have shown her range. But her latest role revelation might make the royal family cringe, as it's been discovered that she once appeared in a very raunchy scene that saw her character getting caught performing oral sex on a high school hunk in 90210. End quote. A woman who has been filmed with her head bobbing up and down simulating oral sex in a car is hardly the kind of woman that has a royal air about her. But this was, after all, a very modern royal wedding. But it wasn't just the sex scenes that will have made senior royals and their most ardent supporters cringe. Her family can be best described as being on the level of trailer trash. Her father, who was meant to be walking her down the aisle, ended up being a no-show, claiming that he had had a heart attack 6 days before the wedding. The more likely reason for his absence was that he was no longer welcome at the wedding. After all, he was caught red-handed, conspiring with a photographer to pose for a series of staged paparazzi photos. I read this from the Daily Mail, and I quote, "Royal wedding scammers. Meghan Markle's father staged photos with paparazzi that were shared around the world and sold for up to £100,000 just days before he walks her down the aisle. Meghan Markle's father has secretly collaborated with a British paparazzi photographer to stage a series of pictures, despite pleas from Prince Harry for the media to leave his future father-in-law alone." End quote. So Meghan's dad was trying to capitalise on his daughter's wedding in a shameless and ham-fisted way, which would be more suited to the plot of a dark comedy than an accompaniment to a royal wedding. However, Meghan's father wasn't the only member of her family who tried to capitalise on the wedding. Meghan's sister Samantha is now writing a book about their past and has appeared in numerous interviews. Meghan's brother Thomas wrote an explosive open letter to the press in which he accused Meghan of using their father for money, bankrupting their father, and then abandoning the family when she had got what she wanted and no longer had any use for those who had supported her. Sounds a little bit like he was trying to call her an opportunist or a gold digger. Interestingly, her brother stated, and I quote, "This is the biggest mistake in royal wedding history," end quote. And he might well be right. But none of those mentioned so far actually made it to the wedding. Her mother, however, who looks like a vagrant, did make it to the ceremony though, complete with nose piercing and dreadlocks. I am pretty sure that if 10 years ago someone had drawn a cartoon of a dreadlocked African woman with a nose piercing stood front and centre at a royal wedding, everyone would have laughed. Well, who's laughing now? This is the grim reality of watching a nation and its culture go down the drain. But it doesn't end there. Another member of Meghan's family that did get an invite to the wedding was her nephew, one Tyler Dooley. He ended up being spoken to by the police in the early hours of the following day after taking a knife into a nightclub, just hours after the wedding had taken place. I read this from Sky News, and I quote, "Meghan Markle's nephew has been let off by police after taking a knife into a London nightclub hours after her wedding to Prince Harry. Tyler Dooley, 25, allegedly fled from security guards after handing in the 4-inch lock knife, but was later confronted by officers at his hotel nearby. He then handed police a pepper spray." End quote. Well, at least you have to give Tyler some credit for trying to fit in. After all, Sadiq Khan's London is suffering from a knife crime epidemic. I suppose Tyler thought carrying a knife was just part and parcel of city life. And all of these embarrassing truths and Jerry Springer-style family moments turned off the British public. And those that were appalled the most by all of this were the traditionalists, those who could be described as deeply conservative, the people who are in fact the most likely to celebrate a royal wedding. And those people turned their backs on Meghan and Harry's wedding in droves. This was reflected in the number of celebrations that took place on the day of the wedding. When comparing the number of street parties held in honour of Harry and Meghan's wedding with the number of street parties held to honour William and Kate's wedding just 7 years earlier, the figures are very telling. I read this from The Independent, and I quote, "Judging by the number of road closure applications received by the county council, Kent is holding 14 street parties compared to 182 in 2011, a drop of 92%. Hertfordshire declared the street party capital of the UK for mustering the highest county total of 298 celebrations in 2011 is down 83% to 51 street parties in 2018. As of the 3rd of May, there were 17 street parties requiring road closures planned for the whole of Wales, not even a tenth of the 2011 total of more than 200 celebrations. And the number of street parties planned in Sheffield has dropped from 31 for the wedding of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge to 3 for the wedding of Harry and Meghan." End quote. So as you can see, the people that were turned off the most by Meghan's antics and the embarrassing circus that her trashy family brought with them were actually the people who were traditionally the most likely to celebrate a royal wedding. The kind of people who would have organised street parties. The sort of people who would go out and hang bunting and fly flags for the event. And those people stayed at home. They simply didn't bother. They turned their backs on the whole sorry spectacle. But was this just a case of a few disgruntled older royalists who were upset over a break with tradition? Did the rest of the nation, the casual observers, and the regular man or woman on the street pay more interest in this very modern wedding? Did this reflection of modern Britain endear the royals to a new generation of Britons? In short, no. In 2011, over 26 million people watched Prince William marry Kate Middleton. This year, less than 18 million watched Harry and Meghan tie the knot. A massive drop of over 8 million viewers. So whilst the press cooed and gushed over the royals going multicultural and embracing a public circus befitting of an episode of Jeremy Kyle, nearly a third of the people who watched William and Kate's wedding didn't even bother to tune in to Harry and Meghan's. And what did those who didn't tune into the live broadcast miss out on? Well, quite simply, one of the most embarrassing spectacles to befall the British royal family. From Meghan's dreadlocked mother to the gospel choir, to the American Episcopalian Bishop Michael Curry who gave the sermon. The whole thing was more than just a break with tradition. It was more than just a bad joke. It was an attack on those of European descent who hold traditional values and just another way to push anti-white ideas, with the sermon itself being a political statement which covered slavery and social justice. I read this from Vox, and I quote, quoting everyone from Martin Luther King Jr. to controversial Catholic 20th century theologian Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, referencing African American spirituals and black enslavement in America, Curry's sermon was a far cry from what might be seen as the traditional aristocratic Anglican sermon you might expect from a royal wedding. Running at nearly 15 minutes, the sermon emphasized the power of love. But the love Curry described wasn't just the romantic love you might express at a wedding. Rather, Curry was drawing on the rhetoric of liberation theology, a 20th century theological tradition inspired by Marxist thought, to characterize love as a necessary, chaotic, and political force. Love, for Curry, provides hope in the face of social injustice, even as it provides a blueprint for overturning it. End quote. The royal wedding was no longer a celebration of British culture, tradition, heritage, and our European values, but was being used as a platform to push multiculturalism and even Marxist ideals. This clearly pleased liberals, leftists, and the mainstream media, but no doubt left all of those who didn't bother to as much as turn on their televisions, let alone arrange any street parties, feel rather vindicated in their decision to turn their backs on the event. And this vacuous, multicultural show of social justice and celebrity clearly didn't go down well with many royals either, who could be seen laughing nervously and scowling during the ceremony. One can only imagine what was said about all of this behind closed doors. But the odd thing is, with all this multicultural pandering, with all this embarrassing political correctness, with centuries of tradition being washed down the toilet, where does this leave the royal family? As the royals desperately try to appease the very liberals and leftists who hate the idea of a monarchy and despise the very notion of ancestral birthrights and the importance of bloodlines, the royals are simply alienating themselves from their most ardent supporters. By partaking in this cringeworthy pantomime, the royal family have potentially done the one thing they can't afford to do, and that's turn even more of the British public against them. And crucially, they seem to have now upset the very people who do value the monarchy, who do value tradition and history. Which leaves us with one question. Is the Harry and Meghan debacle the beginning of the end for the royal family? Oh, and there's one other question. How long before the divorce papers are filed? Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help spread the message by liking and sharing it on social networks. If you want to hear more from me, please hit the subscribe button, as new videos are posted every week. You can also read my book, The Fall of Western Man. It's available as a free ebook and in both hardback and paperback, and all the links are in the description below. Finally, if you want to join in the discussion with me, feel free to add me on Facebook and follow me on Twitter. Also, you can now follow me on Gab, Minds and BitChute as well. Everyone's welcome.